The violet dress felt tighter than usual, the fabric pressing against my chest as if trying to contain the heavy thumping of a heart that had known only devotion for 45 years. It was the dress Arthur gave me on our last anniversary, a shade of deep lavender that he said matched the light in my eyes. Today, however, that light was dim, overshadowed by the clinical coldness of Rose Albright's law office. I sat in the high-backed leather chair, my hands folded neatly in my lap, feeling the absence of Arthur's hand on mine. For nearly half a century, we had been a single unit, a fortress built on sacrifice and shared dreams. I had been the silent architect of his success, the one who sold her mother's heirlooms to fund a dream when banks turned their backs. I was the one who brewed the coffee at 3 a.m. and raised 2 sons while he built an empire. I didn't want the empire. I just wanted the respect of the legacy we had built together. Across from me sat Stephen and Daniel, my flesh and blood, looking at their watches as if this final goodbye to their father's life work was a mere inconvenience. Stephen, my eldest, kept tapping his fountain pen against the mahogany table, his eyes darting toward the legal folders with a hunger that turned my stomach. Daniel sat back, exuding a polished arrogance, his expensive suit pristine, his expression one of bored entitlement. Beside him, his wife Jessica wore a smirk that felt like a physical slap. She didn't belong here, yet she sat there like a vulture waiting for the first sign of a carcass. The air in the room was thick with the scent of old paper and the bitter stench of greed. When Rose began to read, her voice was a flat, rhythmic drone that sliced through the silence of the room. She spoke of construction companies, restaurant chains, and coastal estates as if she were reading a grocery list. To Stephen, the construction empire. $12 million in assets handed over in a single sentence. I saw my son's face transform, a predatory grin spreading across his lips, his eyes lit with the fire of a man who had just won a high-stakes poker game. He didn't look at me. He didn't reach out to squeeze my hand in a gesture of shared loss. He was already mentally spending his father's sweat and blood. Then came Daniel's turn. The restaurants, the luxury condos, the sports cars, a staggering list of wealth that seemed to go on forever. Another $8 million a year in revenue, plus the liquidated accounts. Between the two of them, $30 million was carved up like a Sunday roast, and I was left with the scraps on the floor. As the list of properties and accounts came to an end, a cold dread began to settle in the pit of my stomach. I waited for my name. I waited for the mention of the family home, or perhaps a trust to ensure I could live out my remaining years in the comfort I had helped create. Rose paused, her glasses sliding slightly down her nose as she looked at a weathered, yellowish envelope sitting apart from the thick legal stacks. Her voice softened, but not with kindness. It was the tone one uses for a tragedy. "For Mrs. Eleanor Herrera," she said, "I leave this personal envelope." She pushed it across the table. It was dusty, the edges frayed and discolored, looking more like a piece of forgotten trash than a legal bequest. The silence that followed was broken by Jessica's sharp, piercing laughter. The sound echoed off the wood-paneled walls, a jagged glass shard of a laugh. "At least you can use it to store recipes, mother-in-law," she sneered, her eyes gleaming with malice. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing me down into the chair until I felt as though I might disappear entirely. Stephen didn't even look up from the deeds he was already leafing through. Daniel gave a long, dramatic sigh, the kind of sound a person makes when they are forced to deal with a lingering, unwanted guest. It was clear in that moment that I was no longer a mother or a matriarch. I was a ghost haunting the halls of their new fortune. I took the envelope with hands that would not stop shaking. It felt light, almost empty. It was the weight of a mockery, a final cruel joke from a man I thought had loved me. I tucked it into my purse, my movements slow and mechanical. The lawyers and my sons began discussing wire transfers and corporate structures, their voices rising in excitement, completely erasing my presence from the room. No one offered a hand to help me stand. No one asked how I would get home. No one even said my name as I walked toward the door. I stepped out into the bright, indifferent afternoon sun, the city I had helped build through my support of Arthur, now feeling like a foreign, hostile land. I walked for hours, my tears blurring the faces of strangers, feeling the 45 years of my life dissolving into the dust of that envelope. When I finally reached the silence of my empty house, the shadows of the hallway felt like reaching fingers. I sat in the living room, the quiet weighing more than the grief itself. I stared at the envelope on the coffee table for a long time, afraid that opening it would be the final proof that my life had meant nothing. But eventually, the need for closure outweighed the fear. My fingers fumbled with the brittle seal, the paper cracking under my touch. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded with the precision Arthur applied to everything he did. As I unfolded it, the sight of his handwriting hit me like a physical blow. It was the elegant, flowing script of the man who had written me love letters when we were 20, the man who had left notes on the pillow every morning for decades. But the words were not a poem, they were a revelation. For the woman who always truly loved me, it began. My eyes skipped to the bottom, where a bank account number for the Swiss International Bank in Geneva was written in bold, dark ink. And then, the sentence that made the world stop spinning. What you find here is only the beginning. They didn't deserve to know the truth, but you do. My heart, which had felt like it was dying only hours ago, began to thunder in my chest. What truth? What had Arthur hidden behind the veil of his public life? I realized then that the dusty envelope wasn't a slight, it was a shield. It was a secret gate to a life I never knew existed, a life that Arthur had built in the shadows to protect me from the very sons we had raised together. I clutched the paper to my chest, the coldness of the room replaced by a sudden burning heat. The game wasn't over. It was only just starting. The silence of the house seemed to vibrate as I stared at that single sheet of paper. $100 million. The numbers were so large they felt abstract, like a distance to a star or the depth of an ocean. I sat on the cold linoleum of the kitchen floor, the phone still buzzing on the tiles where it had fallen. My breath came in shallow, jagged gasps. For 4 decades, I had been the bookkeeper of our lives, managing the household budget, saving pennies in the early years, and later overseeing the staff for our estates. I thought I knew every penny the Herrera family owned. I thought I knew the limits of Arthur's reach. But this was a shadow empire, a mountain of wealth hidden beneath the surface of the 30 million my sons were currently fighting over. I felt a strange, dizzying mixture of vindication and terror. Arthur hadn't abandoned me. He hadn't forgotten the jewelry I sold, or the nights I stayed awake with him. He had been building a fortress for me, brick by secret brick. But why the secrecy? Why did he feel the need to hide this from me while he was still alive? The answer lay in the safe deposit box that was now en route from Switzerland. As the sun began to set, casting long, blood-orange shadows across the living room, I realized that my mourning period was over. A new, sharper emotion was taking its place, a cold, calculating clarity. I wasn't just a widow anymore. I was a woman holding a live grenade, and my sons had just pulled the pin. The next morning, the doorbell rang with a precision that felt ominous. 2 men in dark suits, their faces as expressionless as stone, stood on my porch. They didn't look like typical couriers, they looked like guardians. They carried a small, heavy safe between them, their movements synchronized and professional. They didn't speak much, only requiring my signature and a thumbprint before placing the safe on my heavy oak dining table and departing. I stared at the metal box. It was a dull, matte gray, cold to the touch, and held together by a digital lock that seemed to pulse with a faint light. I opened the second envelope they had left behind. It contained the combination. When I saw the numbers, 06, 15, 80, a sob finally broke through my throat. Our wedding date. Even in this high-stakes game of international finance and hidden fortunes, Arthur had anchored the key to our beginning. He was talking to me through these numbers, reminding me of the day we stood in that small chapel, penniless but full of hope. I dialed the code, and the heavy throb of the internal mechanism echoed through the quiet house. With a soft hiss of pressurized air, the door swung open. I expected to see gold bars or stacks of cash. Instead, I saw a meticulous archive of a double life. There were folders color-coded by name: Stephen, Daniel, Jessica. There were thumb drives, small recording devices, and a thick, leather-bound journal. At the very top lay the the one that would dismantle my reality. I picked it up, the paper heavy and expensive, smelling faintly of the sandalwood cologne Arthur always wore. As I began to read, the warmth I felt from the discovery of the money vanished, replaced by an icy realization that my sons were not the men I thought I had raised. Arthur's words were a confession from the grave. He explained that 2 years before his diagnosis, he had begun to notice discrepancies in the company accounts. Small at first, then growing into gaping wounds. He had hired a private firm to investigate, thinking it was an outside job, only to find the rot was coming from within. He described the moment he realized Stephen, his firstborn, was a thief. Stephen hadn't just been managing the construction firms, he had been using them as a personal piggy bank to fuel a gambling addiction that spanned 3 continents. The documents beneath the letter were undeniable, loan agreements with names that made my skin crawl, men who didn't use lawyers to collect their debts, men who used violence. But it was the folder labeled Daniel that broke my spirit. My youngest, the one I had coddled and protected, was spiraling into a darkness I couldn't have imagined. Arthur had documented everything. The secret apartments used for drug-fueled benders, the associations with traffickers, and the horrifying truth that Daniel had already sold off properties that weren't even his to sell yet. He had been forging Arthur's signature for months. As I turned the pages, I saw photographs, grainy, long-lens shots of Daniel in back alleys, his face gaunt and unrecognizable, his eyes hollowed out by a hunger for something other than success. I sank into the chair, the weight of the $200 million now feeling like a mountain of lead. It wasn't just a gift, it was a burden of truth. Arthur had seen the monsters our sons had become, and he knew that giving them the full fortune would have been like giving a match to an arsonist. He gave them the $30 million as a test, a final chance to see if they would honor their mother once the big prize was gone. And they had failed. They had failed spectacularly. The most cutting part of the letter was saved for the end. Arthur wrote about a night I remembered well, a night 3 months ago when he was particularly weak from the chemo. I had gone to the kitchen to get him some water, leaving him, I thought, asleep, but he was awake, and he had heard Stephen and Daniel in the next room, whispering with Jessica. They weren't discussing his health or how to make his final days comfortable. They were discussing me. They were discussing the Eleanor Problem. I read the transcript Arthur had made of their conversation, my eyes filling with hot, stinging tears. They spoke of me as if I were a piece of aging machinery that had become too expensive to maintain. Jessica's voice was the cruelest, suggesting a premium facility, not for my comfort, but because it was far enough away that they wouldn't have to visit. I looked at the contract at the bottom of the safe. Willow Creek Senior Living. A deposit paid stamp was visible in the corner, dated weeks before my husband's heart stopped beating. They had already picked out my cage. They had already measured the distance. They were waiting for the earth to settle on Arthur's grave so they could bury me alive in a luxury prison. I stood up, my legs shaking but my heart hardening into something resembling granite. The woman who had worn the violet dress to the lawyer's office was gone. That woman was a victim. The woman standing in this room now was the owner of a $200 million secret, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to be the supportive wife or the doting mother. I was going to be the reckoning. The house felt different now. The walls that had once provided comfort and warmth now seemed like observers to a brewing storm. I spent the next 48 hours submerged in the contents of that safe, moving between the leather-bound journal and the digital recordings like a woman possessed. Each page I turned was a nail in the coffin of my former life. I discovered that Stephen's debt wasn't just to high-stakes casinos. He had become entangled with a local syndicate that specialized in predatory lending. They were squeezed into his construction business, using his sites to launder money, and Stephen was too far gone to stop them. If the authorities found out, he wouldn't just be bankrupt, he would be behind bars for the rest of his life. As for Daniel, the situation was even more volatile. The traffickers he owed money to were growing impatient. One of the documents in the safe was a scanned copy of a threatening letter sent to Daniel's private office. They weren't asking for the $500,000 anymore. They were demanding a percentage of the restaurant chain's future profits. My son, in his desperation and addiction, was about to hand over the keys to the family legacy to the very people who were destroying him. Arthur had documented every phone call, every desperate meeting. He hadn't just been watching, he had been building a map of their destruction so that I would know exactly where to strike. I decided that I couldn't stay in the house and wait for them to come for me. I needed to see their world through my own eyes, not just through Arthur's files. I began by hiring my own security, a firm recommended in a coded note Arthur had left in the back of his journal. Within hours, a man named Marcus arrived. He was quiet, formidable, and understood the delicacy of the situation. He didn't ask questions when I told him I needed to follow my sons. He simply nodded and prepared the cars. For the first time in 45 years, I was moving in the shadows, a ghost in the city I once called home. Our first stop was a luxury high-rise downtown, one of the condos Daniel had inherited. From the back seat of a tinted SUV, I watched my youngest son arrive. He didn't look like the polished businessman I had seen at the lawyer's office. His movements were twitchy, his skin sallow under the harsh streetlights. He met a man in a hooded sweatshirt near the service entrance. Money changed hands, a thick envelope for a small plastic bag. I felt a physical sickness rise in my throat. This was the boy I had tucked in every night, the one I had cheered for at every graduation. He looked around nervously, his eyes darting like a trapped animal, before disappearing into the building. He wasn't just using, he was drowning. A few hours later, Marcus drove me to a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of the city, one of Stephen's construction yards. It was nearly midnight, but the gates were open. I saw Stephen's luxury SUV parked near the main office. Beside it were two black sedans I didn't recognize. Through a pair of high-powered binoculars Marcus handed me, I saw Stephen standing in the middle of a circle of men. He looked small, his shoulders hunched, his hands gesturing wildly as if he were pleading for his life. One of the men, a tall figure with a scar running through his eyebrow, poked Stephen in the chest, pushing him back. Stephen didn't fight back. He just nodded, his face pale with terror. They were putting the pressure on him. They knew Arthur was dead, and they knew the inheritance was finally within their reach. The betrayal hit its peak when I returned home and found a missed call from Jessica. I listened to the voicemail, her voice dripping with that fake, sugary concern that made my skin crawl. "Eleanor, dear, Stephen and Daniel have been so worried about you since the funeral. You seemed so confused at the lawyer's office. We found a wonderful place where you can get some rest and specialized care. We'll be over tomorrow morning to help you pack. It's for your own good, mother-in-law." I deleted the message, my hands steady. They weren't even going to wait a week. They were coming for me tomorrow, ready to lead me to the slaughter while they carved up what they thought was left of the Herrera Empire. I spent the rest of the night at my desk, but I wasn't crying anymore. I was writing. I was transferring funds from the Swiss account to a series of offshore shells Arthur had set up for this exact purpose. I was also preparing a series of envelopes of my own. If they wanted to play a game of inheritance, I would show them how the game was really played. I had the money, I had the evidence, and most importantly, I had the element of surprise. They thought I was a naive old woman who would go quietly into the night. They didn't realize that I was the one who had taught Arthur how to be resilient when we had nothing. By 4 a.m., my plan was in place. I wouldn't be here when they arrived to help me pack. Instead, I would be at the head of the boardroom table at Herrera Holdings. I had contacted Rose Albright, not in her capacity as the family lawyer, but as the woman who owed me a personal debt from years ago when I helped her through her own scandal. I told her exactly what I had found in the safe. I told her about the $200 million, and I told her that if she wanted to keep her license and her reputation, she would follow my instructions to the letter. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I stood in front of my mirror. I took off the violet dress, the symbol of my mourning and my submission. I put on a sharp, charcoal gray suit I hadn't worn in years, one that made me look like the businesswoman I had always been behind the scenes. I pinned my hair back tightly, my eyes cold and focused. I looked at the photograph of Arthur on my nightstand. "Thank you for the weapons, my love," I whispered. "I'll take it from here." I walked out of the house, leaving the front door unlocked. Let them come. Let them find an empty house and a series of questions they aren't prepared to answer. The reckoning was no longer a possibility. It was a countdown. The morning sun hit the glass towers of the city like 1,000 cold diamonds. but the heat didn't reach me. Inside the back of the black SUV, I felt a strange, crystalline calm. Marcus drove in silence, his eyes constantly scanning the mirrors. On the seat beside me lay a leather briefcase. It didn't contain recipes. It contained the power to destroy 2 legacies and build a new one from the ashes. I looked at my reflection in the window. The woman staring back wasn't the grieving widow who had slunk out of the lawyer's office 3 days ago. This was a woman who had sold her soul's peace for the truth, and she was hungry for justice. We arrived at the Herrera Holdings headquarters 30 minutes before the board was scheduled to meet for the emergency transition of power. My sons had called this meeting to officially divide the assets Rose Albright had read out in the will. They expected a quick signature and a victory lap. As I stepped into the lobby, the security guards, who had known me for decades, stood a little straighter. They saw the fire in my eyes that had been missing since Arthur's diagnosis. I didn't stop at the reception desk. I walked straight to the executive elevators, the click of my heels on the marble floor sounding like a ticking clock. I entered the boardroom 5 minutes before the meeting was set to begin. Rose Albright was already there, looking pale, her hands trembling as she arranged her files. She looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and newfound respect. She knew what was in the briefcase. She knew that the dusty envelope had been a Trojan horse. I took my seat at the head of the table, Arthur's seat. It felt right. It felt heavy. Moments later, the double doors swung open. Stephen walked in first, laughing at something Daniel was saying. Jessica followed, draped in a silk wrap that probably cost more than a year of my mortgage, her eyes already scanning the room as if she were mentally redecorating. They stopped dead when they saw me. The laughter died in Stephen's throat, replaced by a look of profound confusion. Daniel's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "Mom? What are you doing here?" Stephen asked, his voice cracking slightly. "We were just at the house. We came to help you get ready for your appointment at Willow Creek. We thought you'd wandered off." I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence stretch, thick and suffocating, until Jessica couldn't stand it. "Eleanor, really, this is a business meeting. You shouldn't be here. You're confused. The stress of Arthur's passing has clearly taken a toll. We have the car waiting downstairs to take you to the facility. They have doctors who can help with this lapse in judgment." I looked at Jessica, really looked at her, until she shifted uncomfortably. "Sit down," I said. My voice was low, but it carried a weight that vibrated the pens on the table. "Mom, don't be difficult," Daniel snapped, moving toward me as if to grab my arm. "You don't have any standing here. The will was clear. You got your envelope. The companies, the seats, the control, it all belongs to us now. Rose, tell her." Rose didn't look up. She kept her eyes fixed on the mahogany surface. I opened the briefcase and pulled out a single, notarized document. "You're right, Daniel," I said, my voice steady. "The will was very clear. It gave you the construction firms and the restaurants. But what your father didn't tell you, what he saved for the woman who actually built this empire with him, is that those companies are currently hollow shells." Stephen let out a nervous bark of a laugh. "Hollow shells? What are you talking about? I've seen the books." "No, Stephen," I countered, sliding a file across the table toward him. "You've seen the books you've been cooking to hide your gambling debts. What you didn't see was that Arthur had already moved the primary contracts, the intellectual property, and the operating capital into a new entity. An entity called EH Legacy. And I am the sole owner of that entity." The color drained from Stephen's face as he flipped through the pages. I turned my gaze to Daniel. "And as for the restaurant chain, Daniel, the suppliers, the leases, and the branding rights were all transferred to the same holding company 6 months ago. You inherited the bricks and the ovens, but I own the name, the food, and the land they sit on. You have $30 million in debt-ridden assets. I have $200 million in liquid capital and the actual heart of the business." "This is a lie!" Daniel screamed, slamming his fist on the table. "He wouldn't do this! He loved us!" "He loved the sons you used to be," I said, my voice finally cracking with the weight of my grief. "But he knew the men you had become. He knew about the loan sharks, Stephen. He knew about the warehouse meetings at midnight. And Daniel, He knew about the back alleys and the traffickers who are currently waiting for a payment you can no longer make. The room went deathly silent. Jessica looked from Stephen to Daniel, her face contorting with a mix of horror and realization. The trash envelope had just turned their world into ash. Stephen fell back into his chair, his eyes glazed with the realization that he was now an easy target for the men he owed. Daniel looked like he was going to be sick, his hands shaking violently, whether from withdrawal or fear, I didn't know. "You were going to lock me away," I whispered, leaning forward. "You had the papers signed before he was even cold. You wanted to steal the crumbs he left me. But Arthur was one step ahead of you. He gave you exactly what you deserved, the opportunity to fail on your own terms." I stood up, closing the briefcase with a sharp snap. "The board meeting is over. I am the majority shareholder of the parent company that holds your leases and your debts. If you want to keep your houses, if you want to stay out of prison, you will listen very carefully to what I have to say next." I looked at my sons, 2 men I had loved more than life itself, 2 men who had been ready to discard me like a broken toy. The power was entirely in my hands now. I could save them, or I could let the wolves they had invited into their lives finish them off. The silence in the boardroom was no longer the heavy, suffocating weight of my own humiliation. Now, it was the silence of a vacuum, a space where my sons' futures were being sucked away, leaving them gasping for air. Stephen stared at the file in front of him, his fingers tracing the lists of his own debts, as if he could make the numbers disappear by touch alone. Daniel looked small, his bravado stripped away to reveal a trembling, broken man. Jessica, who had been so vocal with her mockery just days ago, sat perfectly still, her face a mask of calculated terror as she realized the lifestyle she had traded her soul for was evaporating. I leaned back in Arthur's chair, the leather creaking softly. This was the moment I had envisioned while sitting on my kitchen floor at 4 in the morning. I had the power to crush them. With one phone call to the authorities or one refusal to cover their debts, I could watch them lose everything. The loan sharks would come for Stephen, and the traffickers would come for Daniel. They would be homeless or worse before the month was out. But as I looked at their pale, terrified faces, I didn't feel the surge of triumph I expected. I felt a profound, aching sadness for the children they used to be. "Here is how this is going to work," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet like a surgeon's blade. "I am not going to pay your debts. Not yet. And I am not going to give you a single cent of the $200 million your father left for me. That money is protected, and you will never touch a penny of it." Daniel looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "But Mom, they'll kill me. You heard what I owe. They don't care about legal procedures. They want their money." "Then you had better start listening," I countered. "I have established a new trust. All the assets you inherited in the official will, the construction firms, the restaurants, the condos, are being placed under the management of E.H. Legacy. You will remain as figurehead directors, but you will have 0 signing authority. Every cent that comes in and every cent that goes out will be monitored by a team of auditors I have already hired." I turned to Stephen. "Stephen, your gambling debts will be settled through a structured loan from the company. You will work to pay it back. But there is a condition. You will enroll in a residential treatment program for gambling addictions starting tonight. If you miss a single session, or if I find out you've placed so much as a $5 bet on a horse race, I will pull the funding. The loan sharks will be told the bank is empty, and you will be on your own." Stephen's mouth hung open, but he didn't argue. He couldn't. He was a man who had been handed a life jacket in the middle of a hurricane. "And Daniel," I said, shifting my gaze to my youngest, "the same applies to you. The money you owe to those dangerous men will be paid off directly by my security team to ensure they never contact you again. But in exchange, you are going to a rehabilitation center in Switzerland. Not for a week, not for a month, but for as long as the doctors there say is necessary. You will sign over your power of attorney to me for the duration of your stay. If you leave early, or if you test positive for a single substance, I will wash my hands of you. You can face the consequences of your choices without the Herrera name to shield you." Jessica finally found her voice, though it was thin and brittle. "And what about me? What about our home, our lives?" I looked at her, and for a moment, I saw the woman who had laughed at my recipe envelope. The house is in Stephen's name, which means it is now an asset under the control of the trust. You can stay there, Jessica, but the luxury cars are being sold. The staff will be let go. You will live on a modest allowance that I will personally approve each month. If you find that life too difficult, you are more than welcome to seek employment elsewhere. But if I hear one more word about committing me or getting rid of me, I will ensure you leave this marriage with nothing but the clothes you're wearing." The room remained silent for a long time. The terms were harsh, but they were a lifeline. I was offering them a chance to reclaim their lives, but I was taking away their toys and their freedom to destroy themselves. I was being the mother they hadn't allowed me to be for years, the one who set boundaries and enforced consequences. "You have 1 hour to decide," I said, standing up. "There are cars waiting downstairs. One is headed to the airport for Switzerland, one is headed to the clinic upstate. If you don't get in those cars, you can walk out those doors and handle your debts yourself. Rose has the paperwork ready for your signatures." I walked toward the door, Marcus stepping aside to let me pass. Just as I reached the handle, I stopped and looked back at my sons. "Your father didn't do this to be cruel," I said softly. "He did it because he loved you enough to stop you. I am doing it because I am the only one left who still believes there might be something worth saving in either of you." I didn't wait for an answer. I walked out of the boardroom and into the hallway. My heart was heavy, but my steps were sure. I had used the dusty envelope to tear down the wall of lies they had built. Now, I had to see if they were willing to build something real on the ruins. I went down to the lobby and stepped out into the air. For the first time in weeks, the city didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like a place of possibilities. I had $200 million and the freedom to do whatever I wanted with the rest of my life. But more than that, I had my dignity back. I was Eleanor Herrera, and I was no longer a ghost. The city looked different from the penthouse balcony of the hotel I had moved into. A temporary sanctuary while I decided what to do with the family estate. The lights below twinkled like scattered diamonds, but for the first time in decades, I wasn't looking at them and wondering if Arthur was working late or if my sons were safe. I was looking at them and thinking about myself. I was 69 years old, and I had $200 million and a heart that was finally beginning to heal from the jagged edges of betrayal. The first few weeks after the boardroom confrontation were a blur of legal maneuvers and silent victories. True to their fear, both Stephen and Daniel had signed the papers. They had no choice. The wolves at their doors were far more terrifying than their mother's newfound steel. Stephen was now in a high-security facility upstate, his days filled with group therapy and the hard work of unlearning a lifetime of risk-taking. Daniel had been flown to a private clinic in the Swiss Alps, a place where the air was thin and the discipline was thick. They were stripped of their phones, their credit cards, and their pretenses. I received weekly reports from the doctors and the auditors. Stephen was struggling. The withdrawal from the adrenaline of the gamble was leaving him hollow and irritable. Daniel was worse. The detox was a physical agony that he had to endure without the shield of his father's money. But they were alive. They were safe. And for the first time in years, they were being forced to face the truth of their own reflections. With my sons in professional hands, I turned my attention to the fortune Arthur had left me. It was staggering to realize the depth of his secret life. There were art collections stored in vaults in London, vineyards in Tuscany, and a portfolio of tech investments that were growing by the second. But as I sat with the financial advisors Marcus had vetted for me, I realized I didn't want more houses or more cars. I had lived a life of luxury built on Arthur's terms. Now, I wanted to build something on mine. I began by establishing the Arthur and Eleanor Foundation for Family Recovery. It wasn't just a tax haven. I wanted to create a network of centers that helped families dealing with the exact rot that had nearly destroyed mine: addiction, gambling, and the toxic greed that can grow in the shadow of great wealth. I spent my mornings in meetings with architects and social workers, feeling a spark of purpose I hadn't felt since I was a young woman helping Arthur map out his first construction site. My name, Eleanor Herrera, was no longer just the name of a widow. It was becoming a name associated with power and philanthropy. One afternoon, a letter arrived from Jessica. It was written on plain stationery, a far cry from the embossed cards she usually used. It was a request for more money, a emergency fund for some social obligation she felt she couldn't miss. I read the letter twice, then picked up my pen. I didn't send a check. Instead, I sent her a list of job openings at the Foundation's administrative office. If she wanted to maintain her lifestyle, she was going to have to earn it, just as I had earned my place by Arthur's side all those years ago. I never heard back from her about the money, but my security team informed me she had started selling off her designer handbag collection. It was a small lesson, but a necessary one. The most profound change, however, was internal. I found myself walking through the city without a veil of grief. I visited museums I hadn't stepped into for 20 years. I sat in small cafes and read books that had nothing to do with business or family. I was rediscovering Eleanor. I found that I liked the woman who had stood up in that boardroom. I liked the woman who could command a room with a whisper. But the peace was interrupted by a phone call from the Swiss clinic. It was Daniel's primary physician. My heart hammered against my ribs, the old maternal instinct of disaster instantly surfacing. "Is he okay?" I asked, my voice trembling. "He is stable, Mrs. Herrera," the doctor replied, his voice calm. "But he has reached a turning point. He has asked to see you. Not to ask for money and not to beg to come home. He says he has something he needs to tell you that can't be said over a phone." I looked at the photograph of Arthur on my desk. I remembered the grainy photos in the safe, the ones of Daniel in the back alleys. I thought about the contract for Willow Creek and the way they had planned to discard me. Could a few weeks of silence and mountain air really change a heart that had grown so cold? Or was this another play, another attempt to manipulate the woman they thought was naive? "I'll be there," I said. "Prepare a car for the airport, Marcus. We're going to Geneva." As the private jet climbed above the clouds, I looked out at the vast, empty sky. I had the money to buy the world, but all I wanted was to know if the sons I had lost could ever truly be found. Arthur had given me the truth to protect myself, but he had also given me the resources to offer them a road back. Whether they were strong enough to walk it was a question that even $200 million couldn't answer. The air in the Swiss Alps was so sharp it felt like breathing diamonds. It was a cold that didn't just bite the skin, it seemed to clarify the mind. Marcus accompanied me to the gates of the clinic, a secluded estate of stone and glass that looked more like a fortress of healing than a medical facility. As I walked through the corridors, the only sound was the soft hum of mountain air circulating through the vents and the distant, rhythmic chime of a clock. I felt a strange sense of displacement. I was miles away from the mahogany boardrooms and the dusty envelopes of the city, yet I felt I was finally approaching the heart of the mystery Arthur had left behind. When the doctor led me into a small, sun-drenched sunroom, I almost didn't recognize the man sitting by the window. Daniel had lost the puffiness in his face, the bloated look of a man living on adrenaline and expensive poisons. He looked thin, almost fragile, wearing a simple gray sweater. His hands, which had been shaking so violently in the boardroom, were now still, folded in his lap as he watched the snow fall on the peaks. When he turned to see me, there was no smirk, no entitlement, and no fire. There was only a hollow, haunting exhaustion. "Mom," he whispered. The word sounded heavy, as if he hadn't used it in a long time. I sat across from him, the silence between us filled with the ghosts of 45 years. I had come here expecting a plea for mercy or a clever new lie, but as I looked into his eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen in him since he was a small boy. Honesty. It was a terrifying, naked honesty that made my own heart ache despite the armor I had built. "The doctor said you had something to tell me," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Something you couldn't say over the phone." Daniel looked back at the mountains. "I found the journals, Mom. Not yours, Dad's. Not the ones he kept in the safe for you. The ones he kept in his private office at the lake house. The ones he thought he'd burned." He let out a dry, rattling breath. "I wasn't just stealing to fund the addiction, Mom. I was stealing because I thought I was already a ghost. I thought I was born into a lie." My brow furrowed. "What are you talking about, Daniel? Your father loved you. He built everything for you and Stephen." "He built it on a foundation of secrets," Daniel said, finally looking me in the eye. Did you know about the project in 1994? The Horizon development? The one that almost went bankrupt? I remembered it well. It was the year I had sold the last of my mother's jewelry. It was the year Arthur stayed up for 72 hours straight, weeping at the kitchen table. Yes, I said. We almost lost everything. But he saved it. He found a private investor. Daniel shook his head, a bitter smile touching his lips. He didn't find an investor, Mom. He found a way to make a problem disappear. There was an accident on that site. 2 workers died because the materials were substandard, materials Arthur had approved to save money. He didn't tell you because he wanted to keep you pure. He wanted you to believe he was the hero you thought he was. He paid off the families, he buried the reports, and he took a loan from the very people Stephen is now in debt to. That was the beginning of the rot. The empire wasn't built on just hard work. It was built on a debt of blood and silence. The room seemed to tilt. I thought of Arthur's elegant handwriting in the letter he left me. For the woman who always truly loved me. Was the $200 million a gift of love, or was it the ultimate hush money from a man who knew his sons had discovered his original sin? I found out 5 years ago, Daniel continued, his voice cracking. I confronted him. I thought we could talk about it. But he looked at me with that cold, professional stare and told me that if I ever breathed a word of it to you, he would disinherit me and make sure I ended up in the gutter. That's when I started using. I couldn't look at him, and I couldn't look at you without feeling like a fraud. I hated him for what he did, and I hated myself for being his son. Every time I snorted a line, I was trying to erase the memory of that file I found. I sat in stunned silence. The image of Arthur, my refuge, my partner, the man of integrity, was being dismantled piece by piece. My sons hadn't just become monsters in a vacuum. They were products of a shadow I never knew existed. Stephen had seen the gambling with the company's life, and Daniel had seen the corruption. They weren't just greedy, they were disillusioned, following a blueprint their father had drafted in the dark. When we planned to put you in Willow Creek, Daniel whispered, tears finally spilling down his cheeks. It wasn't just about the money. Jessica wanted the money, sure, but Stephen and we wanted to hide you. We thought if you stayed in that house, you'd eventually find the files too. We thought the truth would kill you, and we couldn't bear to be the ones to watch it happen. We were trying to bury the secret by burying you. The revelation was a double-edged sword. It didn't excuse their cruelty, their laughter at the will reading, or their attempt to strip me of my freedom. But it painted a picture of a family drowning in a sea of lies that Arthur had started. The dusty envelope wasn't just a test for them, it was a distraction. Arthur had given me the money to keep me busy, to keep me powerful, so I would never have to look into the basement of our history. I reached across the table and, for the first time in years, I took my son's hand. It was cold, but it didn't pull away. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "You could have kept using this to blackmail the estate. You could have used it to fight the trust." "Because I'm tired, Mom," Daniel sobbed, his head dropping to the table. "I'm so tired of the secrets. I don't want the money. I don't want the restaurants. I just want to be able to sleep without seeing those dead workers' faces or Dad's eyes. I don't care if you hate me. I just needed one person in this family to know the truth besides the men in the shadows." I looked out at the mountains, the $200 million in my accounts now feeling like a weight I could never put down. Arthur had protected me, yes, he had ensured my comfort, but he had done it by sacrificing our sons to the same darkness he had walked through. He had left me the truth in the safe, but it was only a partial truth, a version of the story where he was the victim of his children's greed. I realized then that my work wasn't just about building foundations or opening clinics. It was about an exorcism. I had to clean the blood off the Herrera name, or the money would eventually consume me too. I stood up and pulled Daniel into a hug. He felt like a child again, shivering in the cold. "We're going to fix this," I whispered into his hair. "Not with secrets, with light." As I left the clinic, the sun was setting, turning the snow a deep, bruised purple. I had a new mission. I needed to find those files. I needed to find the families Arthur had silenced, and I needed to see if Stephen, in his facility upstate, was hiding the same ghosts. The reckoning wasn't over. It was expanding. The flight back from Switzerland was long, silent, and haunting. Below me, the Atlantic Ocean stretched out like an infinite, dark secret, and for the first time, I looked at the briefcase in my lap with suspicion. I had believed I was the hunter, the righteous widow reclaiming her throne, but Daniel's confession had changed everything. If Arthur had built our fortune on substandard materials and the lives of two men, then every dollar I possessed was stained. I realized that Arthur's dusty envelope wasn't just a gift, it was a distraction. He had given me $100 million to play the hero, hoping I would be too busy punishing our sons to ever look into his own shadows. When I landed, I didn't go back to the hotel. I didn't go to the foundation office. I directed Marcus to drive me to the lake house, the secluded estate where Arthur spent his final months working while the cancer ate away at his strength. It was a place of memories, of summer breezes and quiet mornings, but now it felt like a mausoleum. The air inside was stale, smelling of dust and the faint, lingering scent of my husband's sandalwood. Marcus stayed by the door, his hand instinctively near his coat, sensing the shift in my energy. I went straight to Arthur's private study, a room I had always respected as his sanctuary. I began to tear it apart. I pulled books from the shelves and emptied drawers, looking for the journals Daniel had mentioned. For hours, I found nothing but standard business ledgers and sentimental mementos. But then, I remembered Arthur's obsession with foundation. I knelt on the floor and pulled back the heavy Persian rug near the fireplace. There, beneath a loose floorboard that only someone who knew the house intimately would find, was a small, fireproof box. It wasn't gray like the one from Switzerland. It was black, battered, and heavy. Inside were the Horizon files. My heart skipped a beat as I read the names of the two men, Elias Thorne and Samuel Reed. They were young, 24 and 27. They had families. I found the original engineering reports, the ones Arthur had hidden. The concrete had been weak, the steel reinforcements insufficient. He had been warned, and he had signed the authorization anyway. Below the reports were the payoff receipts, vast sums of money laundered through a series of offshore accounts to buy the silence of the grieving widows and the local inspectors. It was all there, the blueprint of a crime that had been the seed of our multi-million-dollar life. But there was something else in the box, a series of correspondence with a man named the Broker. These weren't business letters, they were threats. It seemed the syndicate that was currently squeezing Stephen hadn't just appeared out of nowhere. They were the descendants of the men Arthur had dealt with 30 years ago. He hadn't just taken a loan, he had entered into a partnership with the devil to save his skin, and that debt had never truly been settled. The reason my sons were being targeted wasn't just their own weakness. It was because the syndicate had decided it was time for the Herrera family to pay the legacy tax. Suddenly, the lights in the study flickered and died. The house, usually so peaceful, felt suddenly crowded. I heard the front door creak, followed by the muffled sound of a struggle. "Marcus?" I called out, my voice tight with fear. There was no answer, only the sound of heavy footsteps on the hardwood. I clutched the black box to my chest, my mind racing. I was an old woman in a dark house, holding the evidence of a 30-year-old murder. The study door opened slowly. A man stood in the shadows, his silhouette tall and imposing. When he stepped into the moonlight filtering through the window, I saw the scar running through his eyebrow. The same man I had seen poking Stephen in the chest at the warehouse. "Mrs. Herrera," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "You have been a very busy woman. We were wondering when you would find your way to the lake house. Your husband was a man of many secrets, but he was always very disciplined about his payments. Your sons, however, they lack his discipline." "What do you want?" I asked, standing as tall as my 69 years would allow. "I want what was promised 30 years ago," the man said, stepping closer. "Arthur didn't just borrow money, he borrowed time. He promised that when the Herrera Empire reached a certain valuation, the founding partners would receive their final dividend. He died before he could sign the transfer. And then you, Eleanor, decided to play the Iron Lady and move all that money to Switzerland where we couldn't touch it." He looked at the black box in my hands. "You think those files are a weapon against us? They are the reason we own you. If the world finds out how the legendary Arthur Herrera built his first skyscraper, your foundation becomes a joke, your fortune is seized by the state, and your sons spend the rest of their lives in a prison cell for the crimes they've already committed. Give me the access codes to the Swiss accounts, and the files stay in that box. Your sons stay alive. You stay a respected widow. I looked at the man and then down at the box. This was the moment of truth Arthur had truly left for me. Not the one in the dusty envelope, but this one. I could stay silent and keep the blood money, or I could destroy the Herrera name to find justice for 2 men who died in 1994. I thought of Daniel's tear-streaked face in Switzerland. He was drowning because of this secret. Stephen was a gambler because he had grown up in a house built on a lie. "You're right," I said, my voice cold and clear. "This empire was built on a debt, but you're mistaken about one thing. I'm not my husband." I didn't give him the codes. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pressed the panic button on the device Marcus had given me. In the distance, I heard the wail of sirens, not just the police, but the private security force I had on payroll. But before they arrived, the man lunged forward. I didn't flinch. I threw the black box into the fireplace, where a small ember from earlier was still glowing. "The time for secrets is over," I whispered. The man snarled, but the sound of tires screeching on the gravel outside stopped him. He knew he couldn't kill the woman who held the keys to $200 million without a plan. He vanished into the shadows of the house just as the first searchlights hit the windows. I sank into Arthur's chair, watching the black box begin to smoke. I had just declared war on the men who had owned my family for 3 decades. I had $200 million, a burning house, and the truth. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid. The smoke from the fireplace carried a bitter chemical scent as the journals and the payoff receipts curled into black ash. I watched them go with a sense of grim liberation. By burning those papers, I hadn't just destroyed evidence. I had destroyed the leverage the syndicate held over my family. As the sirens wailed closer and Marcus burst into the room, his face bruised but his eyes alert, I realized that the only way to truly protect my sons was to take the weapon of the truth out of the hands of the monsters and hold it myself. I told Marcus to gather the security team. We weren't going back to the hotel. We were going to the one place where I could make the most noise, the city's largest news terminal. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind of fire and steel. I sat in a cold, brightly lit television studio, the $200 million in my Swiss account acting as a shield that allowed me to buy the airtime I needed. I didn't hide behind lawyers or PR firms. I sat before the cameras, wearing the same charcoal suit I had worn to the boardroom, and I told the city the truth. I spoke about the Horizon Project, about Elias Thorne and Samuel Reed, and about the blood that had been mixed into the concrete of our success. I watched the live feeds as the Herrera Holdings stock price plummeted into the abyss, but I didn't care. That money was already tainted. I was cutting the rot out of our lives, even if it meant there would be nothing left but the bone. The public reaction was a tidal wave of outrage and shock. The exemplary Herrera family was exposed as a house of cards built on a graveyard. But as the police began their investigation into the decades-old accident, something strange happened. The syndicate, deprived of their secret leverage, began to panic. They had spent 30 years in the shadows, and now the brightest lights in the country were shining directly on their business. By coming forward, I hadn't just ruined my husband's reputation, I had made the syndicate a liability to their own powerful associates. While the world outside screamed for my head, I returned to the facility where Stephen was being held. I found him in the common room, staring at a television that was broadcasting my face. He looked at me, not with the anger I expected, but with a profound, quiet relief. He told me that for years, the men with the scarred eyebrows had been whispering in his ear, telling him that his father was one of them. He had gambled because he felt he was already a criminal, so what did it matter? When I told him the truth was finally out, he wept, not for the lost millions, but because he no longer had to live in fear of the phone ringing in the middle of the night. But the syndicate wasn't going to vanish without a final desperate gasp. On the second night after my confession, as I was leaving the police station after a grueling 6-hour deposition, a black sedan veered across the rainy street, heading straight for my car. Marcus reacted with the instinct of a soldier, swerving the SUV and pinning the sedan against a concrete barrier. Before the men inside could even draw their weapons, my own security team had them surrounded. These weren't the founding partners anymore. They were desperate thugs trying to silence a woman who had already told the world everything. I stepped out of the SUV, the rain soaking my hair and my clothes. I walked right up to the window of the pinned sedan, looking at the man with the scarred eyebrow. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated hatred, but for the first time, I saw the flicker of fear in his eyes. He realized that a woman with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous creature on earth. I had already surrendered my reputation, my husband's legacy, and my social standing. I had nothing left for him to take. "It's over," I said, my voice barely a whisper against the rain. "The accounts are frozen, the files are with the district attorney, and your names are on every front page in the country. There is no dividend coming, only the police." The fallout was massive. The $200 million was placed into a court-supervised trust. Half of it was immediately designated for the families of the victims of the Horizon Project and other neglected safety violations Arthur had hidden. The other half went toward the recovery centers I had dreamed of, places that would now be built on the honesty of my confession rather than the lies of my husband's success. My sons were still in treatment, and they would likely face legal inquiries of their own, but they were finally free of the debt that had been passed down like a genetic disease. As I sat in my small rented apartment a few days later, the silence was finally peaceful. The dusty envelope was long gone, and the millions were no longer mine to hoard. I received a letter from Daniel in Switzerland. He wrote that for the first time in 5 years, he had been able to breathe without the weight of the secret crushing his chest. He said he was proud of me. That one word, proud, was worth more than the $30 million my sons had fought over in that lawyer's office. I was 69 years old, I was nearly broke, and my name was infamous. But as I looked at the sunset over the city, I felt a lightness I hadn't known since I was a girl. The reckoning was complete, but the final chapter, the one where we truly began to live, was just about to be written. The seasons turned with a quiet grace that I had never noticed during the decades of the Herrera Empire's reign. The grand estates had been sold, the luxury cars auctioned off to pay the fines and the restitution to the families of Elias Thorne and Samuel Reed. The city still hummed with the name Herrera, but it was no longer spoken in whispers of envy. It was spoken as a lesson in the power of truth. I had moved into a small house on the outskirts of the city, a place with a garden that demanded my attention, and a kitchen that smelled of cinnamon and hope rather than dust and secrets. 1 year after the day of the will reading, I stood at the airport gate, my heart hammering with a gentle, expectant rhythm. The man who walked toward me was barely recognizable as the Daniel I had seen in that Swiss clinic. He was healthy, his eyes clear and focused, carrying a simple duffel bag. Behind him came Stephen, who had completed his program and was now working as a site supervisor for a nonprofit that built affordable housing, real housing, built with integrity. They didn't look like the heirs to a $30 million fortune. They looked like men who had finally grown up. We didn't go to a fancy restaurant or a boardroom. We went back to my small house and sat around the wooden table I had bought with the last of my personal savings. There was no Jessica. She had moved on to a new husband and a new set of lies months ago, and her absence was a quiet relief. For the first time in 45 years, the three of us spoke without the shadow of Arthur's expectations or the weight of the syndicate's threats. We talked about the victims' families, to whom Stephen had personally delivered letters of apology. We talked about Daniel's plan to become a counselor for those struggling with the same demons that almost took his life. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow across the room, Stephen reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tattered scrap of paper. It was the original yellowish envelope Arthur had given me, the recipe envelope that had started it all. He had kept it. "I used to think this was a joke, Mom," Stephen said, his voice thick with emotion. "I used to think Dad was mocking you, but I realize now it was the only honest thing he ever gave us. It was the key to the door we were all too afraid to open. Without this envelope, we would have lived our entire lives as puppets for the syndicate. We would have ended up dead or in a cell, never knowing who we were." I took the envelope from him, feeling its brittle texture. I realized then that Arthur's final act was more complex than I had imagined. Perhaps he knew that I was the only one strong enough to break the cycle. Perhaps he gave me the money not just to protect me, but to give me the power to destroy the very world he had built. He knew that if he left the truth to his sons, they would be crushed by it. But if he left it to me, I would use it as a forge to reshape them. "The money is gone," I said, looking at both of them. "The name is tarnished. The empire is ash. Do you hate me for what I did?" Daniel reached across and covered my hand with his. "Mom, you didn't destroy the family. You saved us from the lie. For the first time in my life, I don't feel like I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. I have nothing, and yet I have everything." That night, after they had gone to their respective homes, modest apartments they paid for with their own honest wages, I sat alone on my porch. I looked at the dusty envelope one last time. Inside, beneath the lining, I found a small, hidden inscription I hadn't noticed before, written in tiny letters that only a mother's eyes could find. "Eleanor, you were always the real foundation." I smiled, the tears finally coming. But they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of peace. I was 70 years old, and I had successfully navigated the most dangerous poker game of my life. I had lost a fortune, but I had won back my sons. I had lost a husband, but I had found my own soul. I walked into my house, closing the door on the ghosts of the past, and for the first time in my long life, I slept the deep, unbroken sleep of a woman who had nothing left to hide. The legacy of the Herrera family wasn't the millions in the bank. It was the truth that set us free.